Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all here for one more lecture, I would say, in our expanding program on changing Jewish communities. If you don't know yet, we have a fast-growing website on the subject in the JCPA website, and I suggest you all take a look at it because it groups much of what we have published in this field since the days of our founder, late Professor Daniel Elazar, who has of course given very, very much attention to this issue of Jewish communities, who was the scholar who has probably initially taken this subject on a global scale much further than anybody else. Oh, give me the European. Yeah. Before I introduce our guest speaker of today, Dr. Stephen Bayme, I would like to announce two other activities of the center. We will have next week on the 16th our symposium on the relationship, second symposium, together with the Adenauer Foundation, on the relationship between Israel and Europe, with a great variety of speakers on this subject. And on the 1st of February at night we will have the annual memorial lecture for Dan Elazar. You'll of course receive invitations. Here, for those who want to, you can get invitations for the Israel-European relations, dilemmas of Israel-European relations symposium, which will be held at the Adenauer Conference Center. It will not be, please let me make that clear, it will not be here, it will be in Mishkanot Sha'ananim the 16th, which is next Monday. The annual memorial lecture for Professor Dan Elazar will be given this year by Professor Shlomo Avineri. Well, then I'm extremely happy to introduce Dr. Stephen Bayme, who will speak to us on intermarriage and Jewish leadership. This whole issue of in-reach, outreach is a regularly returning issue, not only in the discourse of the American Jewish community, and it is one of our problems, one of the problems, of course, of priority of resources, and it touches upon many other issues which will determine, in view of the large size of intermarriage in most Jewish communities, the future of, will be a determinant factor in the future of many Jewish communities, the United States, but also many Jewish communities abroad. Dr. Bayme is the director of the Contemporary Jewish Life Department of the American Jewish Committee and of the Institute on American Jewish-Israeli Relations. He's a visiting associate professor of history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and if I'm right, you have taught at a number of other universities. He has 3 times been named in the foreword, the weekly foreword publishes each year. It's who are the 50 Jewish leaders who make a difference, and Stephen has been 3 times in that list, and he's the author of various books on American Jewry. Stephen.
Thank you, Dr. Gerstenfeld. It really is my privilege and a great honor to be here at the Jerusalem Center for many reasons. I follow its publications quite religiously. It's required reading for anyone who wants to know about contemporary Jewish life. Follow Dr. Gerstenfeld's scholarship, his marvelous interviews of Jewish leaders, both here and internationally. I've been in this inside this building for seminars and learned a great deal. And behind it all, it's a wonderful privilege to be here at the Institute founded by my late friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Dan Elazar. person who has really defined the entire field, from whom we learned basically all we know. We miss his scholarship, his wisdom, his collegiality, and perhaps above all, his friendship. And in that respect, it's wonderful also to see his beloved widow, Harriet Lazar. The subject I've chosen, I'm trying to define somewhat narrowly in terms of intermarriage and Jewish leadership. Obviously, it touches upon questions of intermarriage more generally, but the more focused question is, how are Jewish leaders responding? What are the implications, the attitudes and implications for Jewish leadership? And to some extent, what are the directions for the Jewish communal future? My remarks will be heavily focused upon the United States, not exclusively so, but perhaps the paradigm from which things began occurred not in the United States, but in France in 1806, when Napoleon posed his 12 questions to the Napoleonic Sanhedrin. The third of those questions, and the one that posed the greatest difficulty, was, do the Jews encourage marriage between Jew and Gentile? It was fairly obvious what Napoleon was getting at. 20 years or so, 15 years after the emancipation of the Jews, he essentially was arguing, how can you really be citizens of France? How can you integrate yourself into French society unless you take a positive attitude towards the prospect of marriage between Jew and Gentile? There has been enormous debate in the past 200 years as to the wisdom of the response of the leadership of French Jewry. To say the least, they hedged. They said that we are not in favor of mixed marriage. However, we do not prescribe those who have married out from positions of leadership within the Jewish community. They did not quite say we're not in favor of it, nor are we against it, although that's probably what they would have liked to have been perceived. I've always argued what's remarkable is that they defied the most powerful man in 19th century Europe. In other words, what he wanted was a clear statement of encouragement, of sanction, of endorsement, and he quite literally did not get it. That has not prevented legions of scholars from criticizing French Jewish leadership in the 200 years since. I've always been amazed by the response of the chief rabbi of Italy, who sent a letter to Rabbi David Sinsheim congratulating him on his response, a view surprisingly echoed by no less a personality than Rabbi Moses Sofer, better known as the Khatam Sofer. One can argue, obviously, this represents more the politics of European Jewry in the 19th century, but it was a statement that the wisdom of French Jewish leadership should not be taken lightly. The question itself poses our dilemma. Do we want integration into the broader society, or do we want a distinctive Jewish survival? American Jewish leadership, probably like French Jewish leaders 200 years ago, would prefer not to choose. They prefer not to give unequivocal answers in favor either of distinctiveness or of integration. Having said that, the realities of Jewish life in the United States today increasingly are compelling choices, painful though they may be. And in this context, I'd like to do two things with you this morning. Number one, to some extent, give a tour de horizon as to what do we know about the attitudes and perspectives of Jewish leadership towards mixed marriage. They are by no means entirely united on the question. As Dr. Gerstenfeld mentions, probably no single more divisive issue in American Jewish life than the question of, so how should Jewish leaders respond? And having completed that tour to horizon, or at least what we do know, both in terms of social science studies and in terms of public discourse or public climate, I'd like to make a few comments about move from the descriptive to the prescriptive and make some suggestions as to what are the implications and what are some of the possible directions. The most important thing to realize, and something we often forget, although it's quite obvious, is that the strictures against mixed marriage have held within the three major religious movements, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. All three are unequivocally opposed, in principle, to the prospect of mixed marriage. Reconstructionism has adopted a somewhat more nuanced position, essentially encouraging rabbis to participate in civil ceremonies, but not in supporting rabbinic officiation per se. But you have the three major religious movements, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, all adopting a position of opposition to the fact of mixed marriage and to its occurrence. Now, there are many differences between those three. I don't mean to tar them all with one brush. However, the fact that the scriptures have survived, notwithstanding the enormous growth in the incidence of mixed marriage, is remarkable in and of itself. The greatest change, of course, has taken place within the Reform movement. In 1979, which isn't all that far back, 27 years, one generation, less than 10% of Reform rabbis were willing to officiate in mixed marriages. And the perspective of the other 90% is that these 10% are pariahs by the canons and values of the Reform movement. That's 1979. By 1996, according to a study performed of rabbis by the Jewish Outreach Institute, 46% of Reform rabbis were willing to perform with various criteria, but they're willing to officiate at mixed marriages. That is a remarkable growth, notwithstanding the fact of inflation. The notion of inflation does not apply to a number of rabbis, thankfully. But the notion of an increase from 10% to 46% represents a remarkable change in values. Secondly, the 54% who do not, by and large, instead of treating the 46% as distant or marginal, the basic attitude is, I don't do it, but I respect my colleagues who do. Irrespective of how you feel about the question, what no one can deny is there has been a remarkable change in values on the ground, even while the Reform movement itself articulates opposition to mixed marriage. Some Jewish leaders cheer this on. The most important, or certainly the most publicly identified of them is Alan Dershowitz of Harvard Law School, better known for many other things. But in a book of his, which I frankly don't recommend, The Vanishing American Jew, he calls for a profoundly new attitude towards mixed marriage, in which it is seen not as a problem, but as an opportunity, and we should, as a statement of policy, we should encourage rabbis to officiate. Come back to this in terms of implications, but Dershowitz is by no means an isolated figure on this grounds. He is articulating what many Jewish leaders want to hear, namely that the old strictures have failed, the traditional policies are bankrupt, it is useless to continue with them, therefore let us shift gears. Let us alter the paradigm. Instead of seeing mixed marriage as a danger to the Jewish future, let us see it as a blessing and an opportunity. Some Reform temples go further, even further than Dershowitz, in other words, and even further than most rabbis who officiate, by a willingness to give aliyot to Gentile spouses, or for that matter, Gentile family members of mixed marriages, of the Jewish side of the family. This, again, on the one hand, represents a new cultural phenomenon, and to be sure, it is clearly a minority of Reform temples, and it remains a distant few. But it's grown in recent years, probably to the point that one scholar estimates about 1 in 5 Reform synagogues are willing to give an aliyah to someone who's not a member of the Jewish faith, but on the contrary is practicing usually Christianity, obviously. There is a particular formulation, instead of the blessing, blessed be the Lord who has given the Torah to the Jewish people. The actual wording is along the lines of, blessed of the Lord who has shared the wisdom of his Torah with all of humanity. The most public incidents of this actually did not take place, but aroused a great deal of comment. Chelsea Clinton, known for many other things, obviously, but among her distinctions was being an undergraduate at Stanford and having an Israeli boyfriend. She accompanied him to Yom Kippur services at Stanford, and the leaders of the service were so honored by her presence that they offered her such an aliyah on Yom Kippur. To her credit, she said it was inappropriate and declined. In recent weeks, a much different development has occurred within both the conservative and the reform movements. Both movements, quite surprisingly, at their most recent conventions, which took place in October and November, affirmed the policy of conversion as the best leadership response to the phenomenon of mixed marriage. In other words, both the conservative reform movements sought to restore the value of conversion as the single best outcome to a mixed marriage. They did so, frankly, for very different reasons. Within the conservative movement, what was driving it was demographics. Namely that the conservative movement in 1990 had been the largest of the three religious movements. By the year 2000, it had experienced a loss of probably from 43% to 33%, depending on how one reads the data. Therefore, there was a sense of, given our losses, let us work towards conversion in the hope that we can recover some of those losses. The reform movement's response, I think, was more interesting because it was driven by something else. It was driven by self-criticism. It was the head of the reform movement, Rabbi Eric Yoffe, in his address, who stated unequivocally, in our desire to welcome, in our desire to be hospitable, in our desire to be open, we have sent the message that conversion doesn't matter one way or another. A remarkable statement of self-criticism. Essentially, it was a comment that the heavy focus upon outreach to mixed marrieds within the reform movement had created an atmosphere of neutrality. You want to convert? Fine. You don't want to convert? Equally fine. I had seen this firsthand myself, admittedly in a somewhat remote part of the United States, but to me it was an indicative comment. The American Jewish Committee held a leadership meeting in Park City, Utah, 2 summers ago. We invited the local rabbi in, and he commented again from I think with a sense of realism, but also with a sense of enthusiasm. He said, here in Park City, we cannot and do not ask questions about who is a Jew. If someone wants to convert, wonderful, we'll make it possible. But if they don't, we make no distinctions between Jew and Gentile. This was exactly the attitude that Rabbi Yoffe was seeking to counter. Once you leave the synagogal movements, and perhaps if I've been sober up until now, it's a sense that at least within the religious movements, the strictures regarding mixed marriage have held, as I stated before. Beyond the parameters of the religious movements, all strictures have fallen. And that perhaps is the most remarkable change of recent years, namely that time-honored Jewish values of in-marriage and conversion have literally fallen by the wayside on our watch as Jewish leaders. First, in terms of professional leadership. There was always the theme within the American Jewish community that leaders of major Jewish organizations need to be married to Jewish spouses. That is no longer the case. Clearly, you're talking about a tiny minority, but the principle has essentially been established that marriage between Jew and Jew is not a prerequisite for heading up major Jewish organizations. This is found on a variety of levels, including, perhaps surprisingly, Jewish family agencies, Jewish family and service agencies, which are devoted to the ideal of serving the Jewish family, yet from time to time are headed by those who themselves are not married to Jews and not leading a Jewish family. It's affected the lay leadership, including the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. In other words, the ideal that to be a Jewish leader on a volunteer basis suggests some element of role modeling, of one forming oneself a Jewish family. That ideal has fallen by the wayside. Arthur Hertzberg put this, I think, quite perceptively a number of years ago. He suggested that support for Israel remains an ideal for Jewish leadership. We would not accept a leader who we do not regard as supportive of Israel, but we do accept those who do not see mixed marriage as problematical, but on the contrary see it as an opportunity. To be fair here again, and again here I rely more on what I call the cultural climate, and we'll talk about this a bit later on, but I think there are distinctions between Jewish leaders. In other words, there are Jewish leaders and there are Jewish leaders. I've met Jewish leaders who are mixed married, who will say quite, I think, candidly, I did what was good for me. I don't expect the Jewish community to applaud it. To me, that's a candid, honest statement. That's one model. The other model is, I did whatever I did. Given my position in the Jewish community, I expect the Jewish community to refrain, if you will, from, at the least, refrain from any statements of opposition. At the most, I expect endorsement and sanction. So what I'm suggesting is that while the strictures have fallen, there are Jewish leaders and there are Jewish leaders. The Federation world, I suggest, has adopted a somewhat more nuanced position, although it's nuanced on the one hand, it's quite simplistic on the other, and that is make no statements about mixed marriage, one way or another. Articulate silence, that's not a contradiction in terms, articulate silence on the most divisive issue in Jewish life because it's a no-win situation. Either way, people will be offended. Some Federation leaders say, I think quite, not with cynicism, but with sincerity, watch what we do, not what we say. If you watch what we do, we're primarily funding programs that will lead to marriages between Jews. Don't watch what we say, because what we say would prove divisive to some of the people who are critical to our endeavor, our collective endeavor. What about public opinion? The most recent American Jewish Committee survey, 2005, but not at all changing over the last 10 years, suggests that American Jewish public opinion has supremacized anti-Semitism and minimized mixed marriage. Each year we ask the question, I'm not completely delighted with the question, but the answers remain remarkably consistent. Each year we ask the question, what is a greater danger to the Jewish future in America? In other words, I'm not talking about Europe or about Israel or anywhere else. What is the greatest danger to Jewish future in America? Anti-Semitism or mixed marriage? Consistently over the last 10 years, by 2-to-1 margins, American Jews opt for anti-Semitism rather than mixed marriage. Part of me says, what world do people live in? Another part of me says, people don't like to see themselves as the problem. Therefore, they say, better the problem be elsewhere. And thirdly, the most cynical part of me says that anti-Semitism serves a fundamental function in the formation of Jewish consciousness and identity. A view articulated long ago by Spinoza, more recently by Sartre. This liberal view on the survival of the Jews, I suggest, is fundamentally insulting because it suggests that there is no internal reason why the Jews ought to survive. But it's a view that's been internalized by many of the finest of Jews, certainly in the United States, if not elsewhere. The 2000 survey, which again asked the same series of questions, but it was the only one in which we did a sort of more probing questions to get at what's behind this, what's the greater danger, anti-Semitism or mixed marriage. In the 2000 survey, we asked more specific questions, and we discovered that 50% of American Jews felt that opposition to mixed marriage